evening. Thank you very much for joining me in the second Joan Robinson workshop hosted by the Joan Robinson Society, which is the economic society here at Girton College. So my name is Sophie White and I'm the president of this society. And tonight I'm delighted to continue the Cambridge tradition of exploring economics outside our tripos. So these workshops aim to kind of preserve Joan Robinson's legacy in her persistent critique of the neoclassical methods. And with that, we're extremely delighted to welcome Professor Maria Marcuzzo to speak at the workshop, which is the first one of this academic year. Professor Marcuzzo is a distinguished scholar in the political economy and the history of economic thought, who has published extensively on the work of Joan Robinson, in particular on Robinson's influence on imperfect competition, effective demand, and capital theory. Please join me in welcoming Professor Marcuzzo. We all look forward to your talk, and at the end, we'll do a short Q&A for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say how delighted I am to be here, to be able to speak to students and to talk, of course, about Joan Robinson. Let me say from the outset that I met Joan Robinson in the mid-70s, so from that you reckon how old I am. So I met her, and I worked about her for many years, not continuously, but steadily, I would say. And I gave a couple of talks on Joan Robinson here in Cambridge, one in Newnham College, must have been in the mid-80s, and another one here at Girton 5 years ago. So this is my third opportunity to address student and colleague, one of the greatest economists of our time. So let me start by giving a bit of biographical background. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but I thought that might be help to give some background. So she was born in Camberley, Surrey in 1993, and she came from a comfortable, I would say, upper middle class family that came in distress when her father was sacked from the British Army. Why was he sacked from the British Army? Because he wrote an article on the time. He was a general in the British Army, so in a very important position. And he wrote an article saying that Lord George was lying about the strength of the army. And that, of course, ended up by a great reprimand who ended up in having him sacked from the army, which was something not... And from that on, from a very comfortable upper middle class environment, she told that she experienced, some kind of distress, and the family was really shocked and hidden by this event. She came from a tradition of dissenters, so it was not just her father, but his great-great-grandfather was expelled from King's College, Cambridge, for taking issue with religious dogma. He felt that the eternal damnation was a silly thing. There couldn't be such a thing like this, the damnation. And that's, of course, rose a big reaction from religious quarter. So you can see her father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, they all coming from a tradition of people who could stood up against the received ideas. And this is something that I believe Joan Robinson got in her milk, as it were. And once she said in an interview she gave, one of the rare interviews she gave, I was brought up in an old liberal religion, believing in progress and rationality of human behavior. So a dissenter, but also somebody who believed the rationality, the pursuit of truth, and the pursuit of courage in your own ideas was something that she believed very strongly. So, in 1922, she came up to Cambridge, Girton, and as you probably know, Girton was one of the two colleges that admitted women. I just give you a few dates to give you a sense how difficult it was for women in those days to get an academic life. So in 1881, women students were admitted to examination university. In 1922, eligible to title of degree. In 1923, to university library. I couldn't go to the library before. And to university lecture. And for all the teaching offices and membership in the faculty and the board. So, it was quite late. How did it work? There was a separate room provided for the examination of women, but in each class of honor was the same standard. It was not different standard for men and women, but women were given supervision with a chaperone. You couldn't have a supervision with the man without a chaperone. You have to give your exams in a separate room. So that we're talking about in the 1920s, where something else was happening around the world that would give women, we're talking about after the First World War, when women had already entered the labor market, but still Cambridge was a little been difficult. And only in 1948, talking about, women admitted to full membership at the University of Cambridge. So it took quite a long time to achieve that. So between 1911 and 1948, few women got a first, either in part 1 or part 2 of the Tripos, but Joan Robinson, who took her Tripos in 1924, was not one of them. Okay? She didn't get the first. She got an upper 2, which was okay, but not certainly a mark that would give an opening in the academic career. So it was a bit of a disappointment, okay? Okay, this is the picture you all know when she was a student here at Girton. A very lovely picture. You can see she's a reflexive, what, I don't know, it would give you a sense of somebody who was not still open up to the world, as it were, It's a sort of inward in a still attitude. Joan Mary Austin O. Robinson was a student of Pigou, and he told me once, I met Austin. Austin died much later than Joan, but I interviewed him, and he told me that he got to know Joan because he was marking Pigou essays during the undergraduate period, and so that's how he met her, and they married. And then Austin was offered a job in India, talking about the height of the British Empire, of course. And Austin was in charge of education of the Maharaja of Gwalior. And so he was offered the job, and Joan joined him as a young Mensahib. And this marked the beginning of a long life association of Joan with India. She kept going over there. She had a lot of friends over there. Started in the 20s until the end of her life. At least I think once a year she used to go to India, and she had a lot of Indian friends and a lot of acquaintances and so forth. So she remained very close to India. She got extremely bored of being the wife of a Don in India. And if you go to the King's College archives where her papers are kept, you can see the letter and the thing that, the type of she had Sunday, they went to the club, played bridge and so on. She got terribly bored. But she enjoyed very much riding, she enjoyed very much going around the country, and this is something that she kept doing. I don't know whether you had any chance to read the first issue that was done by the Cambridge Journal of Joan. It must have been after she died, 84 or something, the first. And there is a nice account of Narasimhan, who was a professor of English here in Cambridge, a close friend of hers. And she said that even in the early 70s, she would get up at dawn, a breakfast with a couple of bananas, and then go swimming or go walking, and she was very much into nature, into things like that. As a matter of fact, she was very close to someone who built up an economics department in Kerala, which is the most southern part of India, just the tip. It's called Trivandrum. And this department was designed by the British architect, whose name now I can't remember, who was very close to Gandhi. And so he went to Gandhi and said, how would you like me to do this campus? And Gandhi said, make it as simple as possible. Gandhi has this sense of nature, of tradition. So don't use all this modern stuff. Use wood. Use the things that are typical of Indian society. And so he did. And so this campus is beautiful. It's in the middle of the jungle. And there is the guest room for professor where Joan Robinson used to stay. Very simple hut, basically. So when I was invited to give the Joan Robinson lecture there, they gave me the honor of staying in that room, which I would have done without very easily, because you had to sleep basically on the floor. The shower was a bucket on the... So, the thing... But she was delighted by being able to live such a... So that was the type of woman. In the late 70s, early 70s, she still liked, and you will see later on, that she still liked to be as simple, as close to nature as possible. There was a bit of British eccentricity to it, but it was also part of her style, okay? So she went to India, and then she managed to find something to do for herself, which was not to be the wife of the teacher over there. And so she worked with a committee in charge of solving a dispute between the state of Gwalior and the central government of India over a matter of taxation. And she helped the state of Gwalior to defend their case against the central government. So she came earlier than her husband, and she gave evidence. And so that was, I would say, the beginning of her involvement in something public, in something that was not just, being a wife. So she came back to Cambridge, and when she came back to Cambridge, she made acquaintance with two people who had an terrible importance in her life. One was Richard Kahn. I don't know how much you know about Richard Kahn, but let me say that was Keynes' favorite pupil, and he was became an important figure in the Cambridge University. He was masterminding a lot of activity in the 50s and the 60s, but during the war, he held positions in the government and so forth. And then the other is Piero Sraffa. I don't know how much you know about Piero Sraffa. Piero Sraffa was rescued by Kane, by the persecution of Mussolini. He was a great friend of Gramsci, a great friend of Wittgenstein, and had a very influential role in Cambridge. I can talk about Sraffa. I can at length, but this is on Joan Robinson. So maybe when I come back, we'll discuss about Kahn and Pierre. But these were two figures that had a tremendous importance for Joan Robinson. Kahn, with whom she had an emotional, personal, and professional link throughout her life since they met and so forth. And with Sraffa was a very somehow complex relationship, but I think it was an important relationship. And certainly these two people, together with Keynes, were the person who was very important in her life. So she attended a Sraffa course. Sraffa came to Cambridge at invitation by Keynes. He had been persecuted by Mussolini. He wanted him to write an apology for an article that he had written against the fascist regime. Of course, Zraffa refused. So he came to England, and Keynes tried to give him a job. And so he was given a lectureship on the strength of only one article that was published in the Economic Journal. This was the time in which you could get a career with just an article, if you had Keynes as a mentor, of course. So he gave this course for 3 years, then he said, no, I cannot teach any longer, because he had stopped believing in what he taught. That was Marshallian theory. And so he said, I can't. So Keynes found him a job from the Royal Society to be the editor of the Ricardian edition, what he did. And then at the end he said, I want to go back to Italy. And so Keynes again wanted to keep him on. So he made the librarian of the Marshallian Library. And then he was head of the research student. In those days there were no PhD, there were just research student. And so Zraffa was in charge of the research student. And then eventually he was made fellow at Trinity, where he stayed throughout his life. In the 1950s, he was asked whether he wanted to come back to Italy. He was one of the few professors who refused to make alliance to fascism. You had to swear alliance to fascism to keep your job. He said, no, I won't. But then he was asked to whether he wanted to come back to Italy. And he said, no, my home is Cambridge. And he stayed at Trinity, where he stayed and died. And then Zraffa, Joan Robinson, and Kahn used to do a lot of walks around Cambridge. And they had, during term time, mostly daily visit to each other. So there was a very close type of relationship with some conflicts, of course. Even when Caldor joined the group, they were always arguing, but they would drop on each other all the time. So this was a group that was not a school, I think. It was a group of people who had differences among themselves, but they were united by the sense of building some kind of Cambridge economics. Okay? So while Zraffa was giving this course, Richard Kahn was preparing his fellowship dissertation. He had as an undergraduate, he had taken a course in physics, but like Joan Robinson, didn't get a first. So if you didn't get a first in Cambridge, there was no, I don't know if this is the same here today. If you don't get a first, you don't get an academic career for you. So he decided then, since he had 1 year of a grant, to do a 1 year economics, and then there he got the first. And Pigou wrote in his evaluation that he was astonished and someone in 1 year could master so much economics. And we have letter by Keynes to his wife, Lydia Lopokova, say, this is the best student I ever had. He must get the first. And he did get a first. And then he wanted to write his fellowship dissertation to enter King's. And Keynes wanted him to do something on monetary theory, and he said, no, I want to do something different. And he wrote The Economics of a Short Period, which is, I think, the foundation of the economics of imperfect competition. And that's how Joan and Kahn became close to collaborate together. But so Kahn was a great influence because he was working on something that became also the core of the first of Joan Robinson's publication, The Economics of a Short Period. But then, of course, the great influence was Zraffa, and she wrote later on, Mr. Zraffa lectures were penetrating our insularity. He was calming, committing the sacrilege of pointing out inconsistency in Marshall. Now, to attack Marshall in Cambridge was not a small thing, and that's what I think is a merit of Keynes, to have wanted someone who was young and had the courage of showing Marshall inconsistency. And I think that Keynes, in that respect, was very open to criticism, even his own people who criticize his own work. He felt so superior anyway that he didn't bother. But I think that it must be said that it was something to be noticed how he decided to invite Zrafa on the strength of an article in which he attacked Marshall, this article was very much appreciated by Edgeworth. Edgeworth could read Italian, so the original article was written in Italian. So he asked Kane whether Zrafa would like to write an English version for the Economic Journal, and Zrafa did in 1926, and this article was the beginning of the criticism of a perfect competition and the basis of the development, one of the major revolutions in Cambridge in the 30s, namely the economics of imperfect competition. So let's have a look this controversy over Marshall in the 20s. So you must be reminded that Marshall was economics in Cambridge. He founded economics. He established the first tripos in economics. He managed to have Keynes take an economics rather than mathematics as he wanted originally, and so on. So Marshall was the big figure in Cambridge. He developed the tripos. He founded the faculty, and so on. But as you can see, he died in 1924. So by the time Marshall had already retired, the other professor, Pigou, who had taken the only chair, there was only one chair in economics, Marshall and then Pigou. Keynes never got a chair in Cambridge. I don't know if you are aware of that. He was just teaching but never got a chair. Robinson got a chair, Robertson, and then Austin Robinson, and then Kahn, and then eventually John Robinson. But so at the time, there was only one professor, and that was Pigou. Everybody referred to him, the professor, because there was only one, okay? So the professor. And so Pigou had transformed a little bit Marshall into a much more logical and mathematically oriented version than Marshall. And that's how Joan Robinson learned it, because as I told you, she went to Pigou lecture and had Austin Robinson as tutor. So what is the controversy over Marshall that erupted in the 1926, 2027? And so there are a few people involved. The first is, of course, Rafa, with his famous article of 1926, which is good reading even now, since we are always given the same story, supply and demand. It's the same story all over the place. And I think that the argument that Rafa gave against the reason behind these curves are still valid today. So I always encourage students to read that article. It's a short article, Economic Journal 1926, and I think it's still worth reading. So this article opened up a discussion, and the main protagonist of this discussion were Pigou, Chauve. Chauve was also an important figure. He didn't write much, but he was very good in teaching. Both Kahn and Joan Robinson remember how he was important, how he had some problem in writing. He didn't publish. He was a perfectionist. When he died, he wanted all his paper be destructed. He didn't want to leave anything. But Kahn told me once that he managed to rescue a little, I think, notebooks in which a student, Saltmarsh, has managed to record the Pigou Chauve lectures. So we have some evidence of which kind of lecture he was doing. And everybody thought of Chauve as a great mentor, a great supervisor. So this is another important figure, Gerald Chauve. And then obviously Robbins, but Robbins was at the LSE, and he was the founder of the economics department at the LSE, very important figure at the LSE, the antagonist at those days, the LSE on one side, and Cambridge on the other side. They had a different view. And then Young, who died very young. Young died very young. And so what is the issue? The issue was consistency and realism in the supply and demand analysis. Okay, let's briefly see what it was all about. But before, I want to remember that the first contribution of John Robinson, the first written piece, is this little booklet. It's called Economics is a Serious Subject, the Apology of an Economist to the Mathematician, the Scientist, and the Plain Man, in which he takes side, as it were, to this issue by saying, as long that we made our premises and hypotheses consistent with the result, we may be allowed to be irrealistic, as it were, to be not close to reality, because that's not what economics do. Economics, they have to forge tools, and these tools might be a little bit abstract, but so that's, she never believed that afterwards, but in 1932 she did. So the plan, in this plan, pamphlet, she defended the methodology of making a realistic assumption against the charge of the mathematician. Mathematician, of course, would defend the logic against realism, and the plain man, of course, would say the opposite. You know, I want to defend the realism of the hypothesis against abstraction. So let's have a look what is the bottom line of these arguments between logic and irrealism. Okay. So what Sraffa was challenging is the Marshallian assumption that there is a symmetry of demand and supply, the scissors. Remember the metaphor of the scissors? You need both scissors, supply and demand, in the determination of relative prices of individual commodities produced under perfect competition. And in order to do so, he invented the method of partial analysis. In other words, you assume ceteris paribus. Everything doesn't change. I can look at one individual market. I don't care what's happening in other market, unlike in the general equilibrium, in which you cannot analyze what happened in one market without taking into account what simultaneously happened in other market. With partial analysis, you are allowed to do so with the argument that either this element, I mean, if I want to determine the price of apple, I don't care what happens to the price of whiskey. You know, the two things are not, unless the commodity are complementary. So Marshall invented this method. It's a method of a short period analysis, and he made the assumption that that these two curves both determine prices. Now, what Sraffa was challenging is the reason for having increasing supply curve and in that particular market. So what is the argument? You know, the argument is you derive the supply curve. Remember, I'm sure that it is done even today. You start from the equilibrium of the firm. So you have your average course, which is U-shaped. Then you have the marginal cost, which is upward sloping. And then you have the demand curve, which is in perfect competition, perfectly elastic. Okay? I'm sure you've seen that graph. This is something there. So Sraffa is saying, why do we have the U-shaped cost curve, which is the basis for deriving then the supply curve? And he said, let's look at the two segments, the decreasing and increasing part of the average curve. The reason for having this both decreasing and increasing are completely different. So why, if I remember the marginal analysis, the idea is that whenever you increase even infinitesimally a small amount in production, you are facing increasing cost. Okay? So Sraffa's argument is that why, is it possible, if I am a small entity, a small firm, we're talking about perfect competition, I'm so small that I cannot have an effect on what's happening in the market because I'm very small. So why is it that I have to assume that whenever I increase infinitesimally of the one unity, my production, I'm facing increasing cost? That would be true if we're talking about an industry. So of course, if the industry is employing all the factor of production, then of course I have increasing cost. So Zrafa was questioning the fact that the upwards part of the average cost make any sense if you are in perfect competition, because you are too small to have an effect on the price of your factor. What about the decreasing part? And Zrafa said, well, if costs are decreasing when you increase production, what would prevent a firm to go on and become the only producer in that market? So the idea again, if you are in perfect competition, you should not be able to become a full monopolist because something stops you. But what is the reason that stops you? And so he's basically arguing that the reason why the supply curve is upward sloping is to make it a symmetry with the demand, because if you want to determine price, then you have to have the cross. And so you need to have the shape of these two curves. And if you are in perfect competition, you need to have the supply, the demand curve perfectly flat, because this is the only way in which you can reach equilibrium. So these assumptions are functional to determination of prices according to the marginal analysis. They are not the reflection of something that happens in reality. And so Zrafa ended up by saying, if you want to have perfect competition, then forget Marshall. If you want to keep Marshall, then the assumption is not perfect competition, but imperfect competition. Namely, the demand curve is downward sloping, and so you can have equilibrium at less than full capacity. That was the logic of the argument. So he ended up by saying, if you want to keep Marshall, then you cannot have perfect competition, because the rationale explaining why we keep imperfect competition is not there. Instead, if you want to abandon the hypothesis of imperfect competition and keep Marshall, then the only route is imperfect competition. And this is exactly what happens with Kahn. We don't have time to discuss Kahn, but let's go to Joan Robinson. So remember, she went to the lecture, she was exposed to the article, this was the big game in town, everybody was discussing the question of, we're talking about destroying Marshall, like, the god of Cambridge economics, and obviously it was a very heated argument. So what Joan Robinson decided, okay, let's follow up. Let's follow up as Zrafa inside and rewrite the economic theory, abandoning perfect competition and assuming that the firm is a monopolist, and see how far we get by this assumption. She began to write this between 1930 and early 31 and nicknamed My Nightmare. Whenever she refers to the book, she said, it's my nightmare. And Kahn, at the time when the proof came, he was in the United States, staying with Schumpeter in Acacia Street. And there is a lovely story that he told me, and then also, I think he wrote somewhere, I'm not sure, but certainly told me. And he would, so Joan Robinson sent all the batches of the proof for him to check, because the book had, I don't know if you ever have a look at it. There is a lot of graphs and so on. She didn't have any maths. She didn't have any confidence in being able to, to have all the mathematical or geometrical right, even if she had a very strong logical mind, but she didn't have the training. While Kahn was a physicist and was in love with her. So the combination was perfect, to have someone to check your your proofs. But he was in the States, staying with Schumpeter. He was having a sabbatical in the United States. So he told me that he got up very early in the morning to catch the mail. For some reason, arrive early, because he didn't want Schumpeter to know that he was receiving a regular mail for a married woman. And we're talking about Schumpeter, who was a womanizer, had the 3 wives or something. So, but Kahn felt that he was very worried. So he told me that he would get up very early to catch the mail. And so this went back and forth and back and forth. And somebody said, well, he did all the work. That's not true. I don't think it is true, although it is at the same time is not true that Kahn was the co-author of the general theory of Keynes. That's what people say. Kahn was the man who put everything right in Joan and Keynes. He resented very much this. He said, I think that my place in life is to check somebody's maths. That's what he said. But I don't think that he did check, but the idea were Joan's. So what was the purpose of this book? The purpose of this book was, okay, let's take Zrafa challenges and show that we can solve it, not by abandoning the Marshallian approach, but extend it to all market form. So the graph that we have in first year undergrad micro, I don't know whether it's done again, but the monopolistic graph with the marginal revenue and marginal downward sloping, that was invented by Joan Robinson, basically. So the idea is that, okay, let's assume that everything is done as if the firm is a monopolist, and see how far. So we can save Marshall. Just saying, okay, forget the perfect competition and extend. And the book gave her fame and academic responsibility. There is a letter by some, can't remember which one it was, but it was a letter that Kahn received after publication of the book, saying, who is this J. Robinson? It's much too be clever to be a woman. And so he showed me that to show that, people still in those days felt that, okay, so the book gave her recognition. She was finally recognized as someone who could be teaching in Cambridge. And she started as an assistant lecturer. And it took her 35 years to become professor. Became professor a couple of years before retirement, okay? So it was a long, long way. But anyway, in 34, she had the first daughter, and she was given the first teaching assignment. So, but what was the quality? Is this the quality of this book? Is it an interesting book? Is it worth reading today? Well, it is worth reading today because this is something that is still taught. So you can see the root of the standard micro. I don't know. People now, I think, do Mascolel, or they do much more sophisticated math. But the ordinary micro undergraduate is very much using the same analytical thing. It's not changed that much. So it is worth having a look at the book. So how did Joan engineer to defend Marshallian theory? Remember what I said about her first booklet. She said, basically, the idea is that provided that we make our assumptions stated, and we say the limitation of our analysis, then we can use it. So we can allow, in Marshall, we just have the case of perfect competition. Let's assume that we have different shape of the demand curve, different shape of the supply curve. Let's assume that we make all the possible cases and state clearly what our assumptions are, so that we can keep this apparatus. Because what Marshall did, he did not make clear under which condition this curve or this assumption are valid. If we struggle enough to find out what are the underlying assumptions, then we can go on and use them. So, but in the end, she said something that we will see remained very important throughout her work, the role of time in economics. And she said, I don't think that the importance is between perfect or imperfect competition. The important is how you deal with the time factor. And this is a topic to which she returned throughout her life, the role of time in economics, logical time, historical time, and so forth. Okay, so what can you say about this book, for which she still recognized as her major contribution? If she would ever had a Nobel Prize, which of course she never did, and she would have never been able to get, but that would be the book that neoclassical economists would have considered to be worth recognized, not her work after that. So what can we say of this book? Was it a real revolution in economic thinking? Was she bringing something that was really, really new? Or was just what I would call a turning point? So my definition of a turning point is just a start on a different track, which may or may not subvert previously held conventional results. Well, a revolution is something that makes the whole thing change completely. I think that the economics of imperfect competition was a turning point. I don't know what's happening. Okay. A revolution changes the way we address fundamental issue, and it comes out as opposed to the prevailing view. So in that sense, Keynesian revolution is a revolution. The general theory is a revolution, because change the way in which we think. It is opposed to the way in which we think of economic problem. I think imperfect competition, as I said, is more a turning point. You know, you set up a track in which you can follow, but it's not subverting the whole ideas. And but at the time when it was written, the book appeared to provide a way to rescue Marshallian theory from Zraffa. But Joan Robinson herself became a severe critic of the book in the 50s. And this is another proof of her intellectual honesty. She said the book is a blind alley. You know, I don't believe it any longer. And that's I think was something that is worth noticing. Somebody who said that book is basically rubbish. You know, I don't believe any words in it. And that's what she said in the 50s. Okay. But I think she became bored with the subject. She thought that didn't lead her to anywhere. And so she was much readier to be involved in the exciting thing that was happening at the time, much more exciting than discussion over the Marshallian theory, namely the development of Keynes's idea. By the way, when she wanted to publish the book, she approached Macmillan. Macmillan was close to Keynes and Keynes' family, but also on her part, she was close. Those days, the upper class were all linked together somewhere, or maybe even today. But those days, you know, you always knew. Her uncle was Churchill's secretary. You know, Keynes' friend, Macmillan, and so forth. Anyway, so when she wanted to publish the book, she wrote to Macmillan, and then Macmillan asked Keynes. So Keynes said, I think you should publish for two reasons. One, because Kant checked so I'm sure it's right. And secondly, because the connection with the family. So, but Kant told me a story which I found very interesting. Kant, was in love with her. He was very committed and wanted her to have succeed. He told me that he was afraid that Keynes was not interested in this Marshallian stuff. He was doing his own thing, and It was not, yes, he had invited Rafa, he appreciates Rafa, but it was not a thing. So Khan was fearful that Keynes might not spend the time, energy to go over it and maybe pick up something that he didn't like and provide not a very good review to Macmillan. So Khan told me that he took the manuscript, took a page out to see whether Keynes had read it thoroughly. And he said, if he said something wrong, I said, oh, you have missed one page. But it didn't occur because Keynes made this comment and the book was published and so on. But just to give you an idea how Khan was fearful, because he wanted very much Robinson, not just because he was in love with her, but because he had a great admiration for her intellect. And he knew that being a woman would not be easy. So he struggled very much to get her accepted in the Cambridge community. And I think that Jane managed to do it on her own, but there was a big push also by Khan. So she became part of the circus. We chose the group of people, Austin Robinson's, Rafa, James Mead, who were a group of, like you, undergraduate, invited to discuss the Treatise of Money, which was the book published by Keynes in 1930. And these people attended the lecture of Keynes, and they were critical of some aspect of the lecture, and out of this discussion, Keynes decided to change track, and this is the road that led him eventually to the general theory. And he acknowledged that it was very important, all the discussion that he had with the student and John Robinson, in the end, was given the first version of the general theory and read the proof. So John Robinson is one of the person who read the proof. And by that time, talking 1936, she was fully admitted, and she was part of the Cambridge group. Keynes had presented the main argument of the general theory in terms of demand of supply of the output as a whole. And I think this was under the influence of Khan and Robinson, because in the Treatise of Money, you don't find any supply and demand analysis, you don't find marginal analysis. So I think that somehow Keynes was a bit under the influence of Khan, certainly, but also of John Robinson, of not discarding completely Marshallian analysis. Of course, Marshall was his mentor. He was brought up in the Marshallian tradition. He wanted to overcome it, but in some aspect, I think he wanted to retain some of the Marshallian. Why? There is a famous letter. He said, I was brought up in the citadel. I know its mighty and power. So I want to fight the establishment, theoretical establishment, by not saying, oh, you're changing all your assumptions. I want to keep as many assumptions as possible from the mainstream in order to show that the derivation of this assumption leads to results which are not correct. So I think he wanted very much. People ask, why didn't he assume imperfect competition? He had John Robinson over there, he had Khan, then Kaleski. Why he kept perfect competition in the general theory, which is something that people say, well, why didn't he discard them? And the answer was precisely he wanted to keep as many as possible assumptions on the one hand. On the other hand, it is also true that he remained a Marshallian, as John Robinson, as Khan were Marshallian, while Kaleski and Zurafa was brought up on Marx, and they were not Marshallian. And so the tension between two lines, as we will see with time, remains something problematic in the Cambridge tradition. There is one trend that is Marshallian, Keynes, Khan, Robinson, and the other is Rafa, Kaleski, Dobb, which came from a different background, and this was never fully integrated in Cambridge economics. And the only person who tried to make this integration possible was Joan Robinson. I don't think that she succeeded, but she tried. So they believed in validity of Marshallian apparatus, and remember, the inventor of the multiplier is Kahn, and the multiplier is based on the idea of having these two sectors, consumption factor and investment sector. But when Kahn was asked, what is your major contribution to in the multiplier, he said, everybody thinks the contribution is 1 over 1 minus c, which is, trivial. It's not even mathematics. It's trivial second elementary school. This is not what I discover. What I discover is to think of the economic system as a supply and demand as a whole. And that's something that he kept saying. While Keynes was alive, I don't think that he never questioned that. But when he died, and when she met Michael Kalecki, she realized that maybe Keynes' assumption and Marshallian assumption were not the best to develop a theory of effective demand. And she kept saying that perhaps Kalecki's assumption was much better. I don't know if you know anything about Michael Kalecki. Do you know anything about Michael Kalecki? Well, he was a Polish guy who got a Rockefeller fellowship to come to England. He wanted to write the general theory, basically. Apparently, he was in Stockholm, and then somebody gave the book, and he realized that the book has already been written. Apparently, he stayed in bed 3 days and say, what am I going to do? And then he got up and said, well, I'm going to do something else. It will be much better. That's what Joan Robinson herself, she met him because one of her articles brought a letter from Kalecki, say, can we meet? And Kalecki impressed so much Joan Robinson. He said, well, this guy, it seems to me to be like in Pirandello plays, he was telling things that we were discovering, and how this guy from Poland, Marxist, how can he manage? So she was very impressed by Kalecki. They gave him a job in Cambridge. He stayed a couple of years, but then he left disappointed because in the end, both Keynes and Kahn felt that he was not part of their setting, as it were. And Kalecki, however, in the end, was discovered by Joan Robinson, in which, because she said in the end, it was Kalecki, not myself, who managed to introduce imperfect competition in the theory of effective demand. And had this version of the general theory been developed, it would have been much better. And she said in the 70s or late 70s, system of analysis in some respect superior to Keynes. So she was fully now accepted in the faculty. She wrote, she decided that the general theory need to be popularized, need to be known, and so she wrote these 2 books. And I would recommend still this book, The Introduction to the Theory of Employment, 1937, is popularization version of the general theory, very easy reading. It was meant to be written for supervision for students. Keynes was not so happy that after 1 year that his book is out, this lady comes out and say, I write a popular version of your book. But in the end, you have been successful and simplified. They've stated some of the complications beautifully. So Keynes was very supportive of her academic career and stepped in when there was an opposition of having her given a lectureship in 1935, and all his authority and his prestige was used to defend her. And there is this famous sentence, we are not the LSE here, we are Cambridge. So we have to allow people of different opinion, because of course she already very vociferous. She was saying that everybody else was teaching nonsense, that you can imagine she was not very balanced in her judgment. So she would make a fuss on the old style teaching. And that obviously got on the nerve of people like Pigou, Robertson. So this young lady just got a lectureship and she started telling that we are teaching rubbish. But Keynes stepped in, and she said she had the merit, she had the qualifications, so we should give her the lectureship. And in the end, she was given the lectureship in 1935. And the relationship with Keynes was obviously very important and very smooth. There was only some point in which she defended Kalecki against Keynes. This is another proof of her character. She would not hesitate to stand up against Keynes if she thought that there was a point to be said about Kalecki, and that's another element of Joan Robinson thing. Now, the other important trend that we have to notice when we're talking about Cambridge and Joan Robinson is the influence on Marx and Marxism. In the 1930s, Marxism was a popular cult among the undergraduate in Cambridge. You know, there was this issue, fascism and communism on the other side, and there was this totalitarian regime, but the idea was that perhaps Marxism was the answer to the problem of capitalism. And even Joan Robinson was caught in, and she said, in order to get away of the bad news of the war, I started reading Marx. So she started reading Marx in 1940, and Dobb and Kalecki were their main influence. And so in 1942, she wrote this book, An Essay on Marxian Economics, and Kalecki was very appreciative. Zrafa made a joke. You said, you made Marx a little unknown predecessor of Kalecki, but that's all right. So she wrote this book, and she said, you know, the important thing is that Marx is important. You economy has to be aware that this is important. Forget about the theory of value. Theory of value is not important in the sense of a theory of relative prices. So if we get rid of the labor theory of value, nothing important would be lost. And she said, for this reason, for having said that the labor theory of value, the theory of value is not important in Marx, I've been treated by enemy by all the professed Marxists. They call it the bourgeois Keynesians. She doesn't understand Marx and so forth. But again, she stood her grain in this. She didn't like the issue of the transformation problem, you know, prices, value in price of production. And she said, also the problem of unemployment with the reserve army of labor. I don't know how familiar you are with these things of Marx, but the main idea is that unemployment can be explained with the reserve of labor, reserve army of labor. The capitalist, whenever there is an issue of increase in salary, they start sacking people, and they keep always a pool of unemployed people in order to prevent wages to go up. And he said, yeah, this is an explanation of unemployment, which is not exactly the same as the theory of effective demand. So these two issues, she became in great opposition with the standard interpretation by Marxists. But in the end, when she reflected back, she said, for me, the main message of Marx was the need to think in terms of history, not of equilibrium. And then he said, well, if you want to extend the general theory at the long period, because remember the general theory is a short period analysis, if you want to extend it to the long period, then Marx is very useful. So in the 50s, the program was to extend the general theory to the long period, and they use an analysis of accumulation in which the influence on Marx in Joan Robinson's case could be seen as clearly. Now, if you look at the Marxists today, they would argue that some Marxists today would accept that perhaps the labor theory of value is not as important as they thought. And particularly after the publication of Zrafa books, they felt that perhaps we can have a theory of exploitation without having the labor theory of value. And Of course, this is not something that all Marxists would accept. To all Marxist conference that you go, if you don't swear on the labor theory of value, is not good. But some Marxists accept the challenge and say, okay, there are important things about Marx that are not confined to the general theory of value, the understanding of capitalism and so on. And even on the theory of effective demand of employment, there are different views, and I give example of these two views in my paper. Okay, let's get to Zrafa now. I said that she attended a lecture. So let's look at the relationship between Zrafa and Robinson, okay? So I told you that she attended the lecture. I told you that she dedicated, no, I didn't tell you, I'm telling now. She dedicated the first book to Zrafa, but Zrafa was not happy. He said, I don't like you to dedicate this to me. So I think that in the final edition, she erased the name and she just put to the fundamental pessimist, which is Zrafa. And while she was writing the Economics in Perfect, she was very apprehensive of Zrafa. She was asking him, am I doing right, and so on. He was not happy with the book. He felt rightly that she was not taking his point. And so it was only after the war that Zrafa work had a major influence. Throughout the 30s, because she was involved with Keynes, because Zrafa didn't appreciate much imperfect competition, the relationship was friendly, but not productive in any sense. So why was Zrafa at one point became so important, okay, in her life, not in her life personally, because he had always remained important. But when did he become important in terms of intellectual influence on her? She said in the 50s, what was our theoretical problem? Our theoretical problem, we had the theory of effective demand, we have understood the perfect competition was not the right assumption. But what we were lacking? We were lacking an adequate conception of the rate of profit. Because on the basis of Keynes and Kalecki theory of effective demand, we can determine total profit. But in order to determine the rate profit, you have to have a theory of how to measure the stock of capital, because the rate of capital is the ratio between profit to capital and has to be done in value term. But in order to do it in value term, you have to have a theory. You have a way to measure capital. So you have to know the rate of profit in order to measure the value of capital. In order to determine the rate of profit, you have to know the value of capital. So, I mean, the thing cannot be solved. And so she said, I had innumerable discussions with Piero, but they always consisted in his heading me off from errors. He would never say anything positive. This was typical of Zrafa, you know. Everybody who had contacted him, he was always very reluctant to have his idea presented before they were fully developed and so forth. And so he said, it was not until I found the corn economy in his introduction to Ricardo's principle that I saw a gleaming light on the question of the rate of profit. So I don't know whether you're familiar with this corn ratio profit in Ricardo. Ricardo at one point made the assumption that if we take capital and output being made of the same commodity, say corn, then we can determine the rate of profit without introducing any value magnitude, because you measure everything in physical terms. And so Zrafa said this intuition was that if you, in order to get away from the valuation problem and the measurement of capital, maybe you have to think in physical terms. Of course, there is a problem of aggregation, because capital is made up of different commodities, and so that's what Malthus told him. This is a realistic assumption. But that was a way to point to the direction. You have to get away from the valuation of capital. In fact, in production of commodity, you have a list of physical commodities in order to determine prices. You don't measure in value term. Anyway, that's what the clue that she had from the introduction to the collection of Ricardo works, which was published in 1951. Piero Sraffa's introduction to Ricardo principle caused me to see the concept of the rate of freedom capital is essentially the same in Ricardo, Marx, Marshall, and Keynes, while the essential difference between these on one side, Barras, Pigou, and latter-day textbooks on the other, is that the Ricardians are describing a historical process of accumulation in changing world, while the Varrasians dwell in a timeless equilibrium where there are no distinction between future and the past. So she could see in the introduction the clue of the possibility of determining the rate of profit, the possibility of treating capital and prices in a way which was very much different from the way in which general equilibrium was treated. So what did the corn economy reveal to Joan Robinson? That's what Sraffa taught us, okay? So any change, remember what I said when you discuss capital in value term, any change in the distribution between wages and profit alters the relative value of commodities, of course, because whenever there is a change in wages, you will have a change in prices, and therefore by introducing this corn ratio, you get away from the problem of devaluation of commodity. Of course, it's a realistic assumption, but gives you an idea that the problem of devaluation of capital is central for the determination of the rate of profit. And so she ended up by saying that in that famous article of 1954, which is considered to be the beginning of the capital controversy, is that she said what the neoclassical cannot do is to understand that there is a distinction between the rules of production and the rule of distribution. And they keep to determine the two things simultaneously, and that's what prevents them to understand what the problem of capital is about. And this is a picture of hers in those years when she did. So when Sraffa published his book in 1960, she was very much ready for it. And what was the significance of this book for Joan Robinson? Remember, the point is to keep distribution distinct from production. And in neoclassical theory, what determines distribution is marginal productivity, wages, marginal productivity of labor, capital, marginal productivity of capital. Of course, in order to find the marginal productivity of capital, you have to measure it in value terms. And so we are back to the original problem. How can you find the marginal productivity of capital if you cannot measure in value terms? And so she said, what Sraffa showed us is that possible to have a theory of distribution which is independent of production. We can have a theory of prices which is not based on marginal analysis. And this was the real revolution, the second great revolution. This was really a revolution in Cambridge, Keynes and Sraffa. The imperfect competition was half-baked. And so she said what Sraffa taught us, that we can go back to the classic, Marx, Ricardo, and so on, forget about marginal analysis, forget about disequilibrium, and establish a theory that is on different grounds. Okay? So we have let's forget about reswitching, which is another consequence. I want to speed up a little bit. So what is the lesson of Sraffa? Is the idea that the capital theory is completely faulty in neoclassical theory, that we should go back to the classical analysis, and in particular, what the neoclassical cannot see, that there is a distinction between changes in the condition of production of given output from fact that the capital appear to change whenever you change prices and distribution, because the same value, whenever the same capital have a different value when you measure with different wages and profit. I think the most important interpretation of Zrafa, what she took home, was the idea that in neoclassical term, you cannot analyze changes because you don't have time into it. Everything happened, collapse in the same logical time, unlike the classical theory in which you can do that because you're not committed to that simultaneous approach of distribution and production. But of course, even with Rafa, there was some disagreement. And the disagreement was that Rafa was criticizing all neoclassical economics. He was saying all neoclassical economics, we should get rid of it and we should build on classical economics. Why Joan Robinson said, well, it's the notion of equilibrium we should get rid of. And he felt that even Rafa somehow was not fulfilling his task because he introduced some type of equilibrium analysis. I just want to mention that in the 50s, she did a lot of growth models. She's known for the accumulation of capital. She's known to, but she kept saying that she wanted to introduce an historical time in the analysis. She wanted to use the Marxian classical approach rather than neoclassical approach. And that is something that she kept repeating all over again. So she went in the 60s, she spent a lot of time in trying to analyze the capitalistic system from the point of view of accumulation, from the point of view of what happens in real life, not having growth model as we have of Solow or something. She debated a lot on Solow on this, saying this is not the way to approach growth, this is not the way to understand. But in the 60s, she was also concerned with other things. Have you seen in my paper on the reviews, she was concerned with political issues, coexisted between East and West, concern for development. She traveled a lot, India, Ceylon, Cuba, Korea, especially China. She was not just involved in theoretical stuff. She was also very much concerned with the problem of the Cold War, the coexistence, and so forth. And she got a lot of interest in methodology. She was concerned with topic of methodology. How do you distinguish between propositions that are scientific and ideological? She got a little bit too much into Popper at one point. She worked too much to my mind, but then she changed it. She always changed after a while. She said, no, this is rubbish. But I think this sentence I would like to read is something that she cared a lot. She said, logic is the same for everybody. The same logical structure, if it did not fudge, can support different ideology. So she wanted to say, let's keep ideology and logic separate, like with the labor theory of value. You know, if it is logically false, let's get rid of it and not because of the ideology accept a logic that is not faulty. And so I think that she wanted very much to study what is the role of hypotheses and what importance they had in life. I'm getting close to the finish. She became a professor in 95. She gave an inaugural lecture on protectionism, and this is a picture of her when she got the professorship. And then, of course, she's important for the birth of post-Keynesian economics, and she's been trying to build up a theory that have all these different strengths, the Zrafa and the Keynesian strength, and she wanted to get rid to an alternative and trying to mix all good and bad that was in Cambridge, try to make something that was much more organic, not just Keynes, but Zrafa, but Ricardo, but Marshall. And I'm not sure she succeeded, but she certainly considered the figure, the central figure in post-Keynesian economics. So let me get close to, I forget about the disagreements and the defense, and let's look at what are the two ingredients for the post-Keynesian theory. what are the ingredients of the integration between the Keynesian, the Marxist, and the Zrafan? She said, one is negative. We are all united against something, okay? And what are we against? The weakness of notion of an equilibrium and the supply and demand, okay? This is the negative aspect. She insisted that even the Zrafians sometimes insist too much on equilibrium. We should get rid of equilibrium. Forget about equilibrium and build something that doesn't have equilibrium in the analysis. And what is the constructive part? The constructive part is to use what Marx had taught us about capitalism and what Kaleski had shown us as a part of the rules of capitalism, and try to blend Marx, Keynes with Zrafa and to Keynes in a positive sense, not just in the negative, against something, but pro something. So it is a project to be accomplished. It's up to you. I'm talking to you. It's up to you to bring it to fruition, because she just put some elements and she never accomplished. I think that it was an attempt that I'm sorry to say didn't succeed entirely. So in the end, she became herself disillusioned. Her last paper, as you all know, is very pessimistic. It's spring cleaning, we get rid of everything. It's more what you get rid of and some hope that we can construct something for the analysis. She was concerned with the arms race, with the war, and let me finish with something she said. I've realized more than ever how much one whole personality is involved in one's intellectual work. I think the reason I've done so much more with much weaker brain than any of us, because of my extremely simple-minded attitude. I don't think that Joan Robinson was simple-minded. She was intellectually daring. And as we know, she died in Cambridge. And I would like to finish with a portrait, an obituary, that was written in the Times, was published in the Times by somebody was staying in her home. She rented a room, and this lady, Carmen Blanket, wrote this obituary. A street vegetarian, she slept all the year around in a small creep-covered hut at the bottom of the garden that was 62 Grand Road, still now. It was entirely unheated and open to one side to all weather, but no storm, deluge, or frost could persuade her to sleep in the house. Every morning at 5 minutes to 8, I would see her walking over the lawn to her breakfast of yogurt in a maroon dressing gown with her long grey hair hanging down her back. In the early spring, she was often woken by tits pecking at the air for material for their next. Once she awoke to find a new pair of Marks and Spencer bedroom slippers entirely filled with nuts. The squirrel came from Trinity, she declared, and promptly and considerately reverting to the old pair. And this is how I think we would like to remember her. Thank you very much, and sorry for the overtime.
Okay, thank you so much for that really insightful talk. It was really descriptive of Joan Robinson's life, and I definitely learned something new. We now have about half an hour-ish for like a Q&A of any questions for Professor Marcuzzo, anything about Joan Robinson or her work and the microphone.
Or Cambridge economics,
round, yeah, anything. So is there anybody who wants to start?
I was curious about Joan Robinson's rejection of general equilibrium theory.
Yeah.
And what were her reasons for that? You said she wanted to get rid of it.
Well, I think basically she felt that the general equilibrium approach is very much limited by the necessity of using a type of economics, a type of maths that is not, the maths may be sound, But what is behind that math is not sound, namely the supply and demand analysis. There is no consideration of the problem of the value of capital. And so she felt that it is too much grounded on the notion of equilibrium. So she, throughout her life, she somehow stressed different aspects of what she didn't like of general equilibrium. But I would say that basically what the idea that there is a logical time, there is no room for something that you would call historical time, something, events that happen in reality. You just have the time, the logical time that everything happens at the same time, simultaneously. And this is a representation of reality that, according to her, does not have any way to make us understand how capitalism works. It's too abstract, logically false because of this issue I just mentioned on supply and demand, and especially the idea that distribution and production are rules by the same laws. While she said you have to separate the law of distribution, the idea that wages are the remuneration of the marginal productivity of labor, or profit is the marginal productivity, which is at the root of any neoclassical theory. This is what she considered to be completely untenable. You know, profit and wages are determined in a way, according to the classical theory, that are separate from the laws of production. But basically, I think it's time, equilibrium, and production and distribution, the three things that she didn't approve of. Yeah, I don't know.
Kind of leading on from that, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that idea of historical time, and more specifically kind of where it was theoretically derived from, something that came slightly later on, whether that was incorporated into growth models, which we briefly skipped over.
Well, she praised more than she did. Okay? She said that we want to do historical time and so forth, but then their model were very much, I don't think that she succeeded entirely in what she wanted to do, because it's very difficult. It's very difficult to, in economics, how do you do historical time? I mean, it's not that easy. So she said, in the growth model, I want to show under which unrealistic assumption this model are constructed. So she presented the model as a benchmark to say this is not how the world really work. For instance, the assumption of full employment. You know, I have to show under which condition the variable in this model will have to behave in order to have full employment. But so people said, well, but that you're not doing much different from what everybody else is doing. So where is the historical time? And to be honest with you, I don't think that she succeeded. She praised a lot. We should get rid of equilibrium. We should try to put history in our analysis and so on. But when she does the model, I don't think that she succeeded in the 60s and the 70s. Then why I think she gave up writing model at one point.
Also, where was the, it's working now, where was the kind of theoretical beginnings of the idea of historical time? Was there any, where she was looking or inspired by, was it Marx's historical material?
Yeah, I think it was Marx.
Yeah, okay,
I think it was Marx. She said, well, Marx doesn't talk in terms of equilibrium, doesn't talk about, he tells us how capitalism work, and he does it in a way that modeling is not necessary. So she said, it's not that I don't know mathematics, which is true. Everybody who has worked with her said that she had a fantastic logical mind. She could grasp the implication of everything, even if she didn't have any math in her training. So it was not lack of ability to be logical about things. It was rather the fact that she was politically very committed. She said, I went into when I was young, I decided to do economics because I wanted to find a cure to poverty. So she felt that, she wanted to have answer to real questions. She was, and I think that when she had to build a career, as everybody else, she had to make compromise. She wrote Economics of Imperfect Competition because it was an academic book. She believed that she really believed that you could go around with assumption and make them logically consistent. She was an extremely intellectually honest person. So she never, but obviously she was also the daughter of her times. So if you want to get a lectureship in Cambridge, there are things that you have to do. And I think that while Keynes was around, she had the feeling that they have found really the holy grail, that Keynes was giving the answer to all the questions. But then Keynes died very early. And then they were left with this legacy of extending the general theory to think that the general theory doesn't have distribution, long period, growth, inflation. And so they were struggling to build something that was a legacy, to build. And by the time Cambridge was losing the centrality and America was becoming the place where people go, and until I think the 50s, Cambridge was still important. By the end of the 50s, the MIT, Harvard, and these places were getting. And it is well known that Rockefeller financed a lot of people going to the United States. It was the Cold War. There is a story which I'm not sure I believe, but that when the Cold War ended in the mid-50s, there was a lot of unemployment among physicists. Where did they go? Guess? They went in the economics department. And so there is this theory, might be a little bit conspirational, but the idea is that economics turned into maths, for a lot of maths, for two reasons. One, because with the rise of computer prediction and so on, everybody was crazy in financing projects in which you could make prediction. There was computers, there were firms. The other idea is that the subject became more mathematized because they want to get rid of the political aspect. Harrow, the great Harrow, Nobel Prize, said he was a socialist and he knew that he wanted to keep a job. He had to do a lot of maths and less political. So I think that Joan Robinson felt that very, very clearly. That's why she was very much into this idea of trying to keep logic separate from ideology. But this is not something that can be easily done. So I don't know whether I answered your question. Did I? Yeah.
You mentioned that she wasn't successful in modeling the idea, she was trying to get into historical time and stuff, and she wasn't successful in sort of creating a model for that. Do you think it's possible that the reason she wasn't successful is because she was trying to create a model in the first place, and maybe she shouldn't have been trying to create a model for something that can't really be modeled? She was going away. Yeah,
I think it's a good point. I don't think that you can, in modeling, I don't think you can have historical time. And so the question is giving up model. I think that she would not object to modeling as one aspect of our activities as economists. I think she would object, as I would object, that the only way of thinking in economics is through a model. Modeling meaning something that is constructed in such a way that you have to force your assumption in order to be able to test the model. Because any theory can be seen as a way, to make an assumption, and then you cannot have a map one-to-one to reality. So, of course, we all know that we need to make simplification and so on. I think that she felt that the need of modeling, of mathematization, had gone too far, concealing what are the theoretical problems behind it. And so her insistence on historical time was saying, listen, equilibrium is not the only way to think about how the system behaves. And trying to find an equilibrium solution seems to be much more something that comes from maths than from economics, you know. So you have to find definite answers and so on. So she felt that Keynes and Marx had been more successful in trying to explain capitalist economy without having a model in the sense of something that is mathematically close and giving you the result which are based on the equilibrium method. The equilibrium method is that you find solution to a model. You find mathematical solution. The equilibrium is a resting point, okay? Equilibrium is a resting point. And the way in which you determine or define equilibrium is very much conditional to the kind of maths that you use. Instead, if you're not committed to find an equilibrium solution, the word solution points to a mathematical exercise, right? If you're not committed to find an equilibrium solution, but you're committed to find an explanation, then you have scope maybe to, I'm not saying you don't have to do model, but modeling must not be the only way to think about the system. And this is what unfortunately is happening. Happened in her time, is happening now. You know, we want to, I mean, if you read Marx or Keynes or Kaleski and so on, so maths is, well, I mean, you're all familiar with Tony's argument, you know. You don't use a hammer if you just want to, you know, to write a paper. You know, the tools have to be appropriate to the problem. And the idea that maths is the tool that's appropriate for any type of theory, this is just something that is not there, you know. So you can use math when maths is useful, when you need to do something, but it's not the only language that economy should be taught. Being mathematical doesn't mean to be scientific. You know, the whole idea that in order to be scientific you have to put a lot of maths into things. Again, this is another thing that is not what is another matter how you test what does it mean to be scientific. This is a complicated story. But I would certainly argue that believing that the more maths you put, the more scientific you are. But yours, I hope that you've been listening to Tony Lawson and can tell these things better than I can do.
Right, thanks very much for the talk. You touched a lot about Joan's relationships with her contemporaries, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about personal academic relationships with the next generation in Cambridge and of the early post-Keynesian movement post the Ely lectures and so on.
Well, these people were not very good in leaving a legacy. They did promote the wrong people. They didn't promote the right people. I mean, it was a mess. I don't know if you're familiar with this book by Saith on the Cambridge. The story is that these people made a mess. They were not able to, I mean, the circumstances had changed a lot, so obviously, but I think that they were not very good in giving a second generation a chance to survive in Cambridge. Well, it was Nicky Caldor who invited Frank Hahn in Cambridge. So, I mean, Pasinetti was not given a chair. All the story the site said. So I think that as far as the second generation, they are certainly guilty of not being able to produce a second generation or third generation that we follow up. Of course, the circumstances were different. Of course, the influence of America was overwhelming. But I think they were not able to think of the future of Cambridge in a way that would assure a continuation of their legacy. And that has been beautifully told by this book by Saith, I think.
Can I, sorry, just add a little bit. What about outside Cambridge? Were there any, I don't know, any roots of her type of thinking that she left in other?
Well,
places?
I mean, I was telling Anthony's that, I've traveled a lot in my life, in my professional career. And in many places where I've gone, in Japan, in Mexico, in the United States, you find people who really think that she is the inspiring figure, and other post-Keynesians, so forth. So this tradition is not lost, is not has not disappeared, is not concentrated in one place. No, it's no Cambridge, no New School, no Amherst, no this so-called heterodox. It's not concentrated, but does not mean that they are not post-Keynesian or people who have Australians or Keynesian around the world. As a matter of fact, there are many, there are several. And the question is that there is no critical mass enough to be able to take over a department or an institution, because the other side is much more powerful in terms of publication records, in terms of being more, able to rule the game. So I think there is also a little bit of inability of people who are always in the opposition, and this is also in politics, it's not just in economics. If you look at the left, everywhere, they are much less able, to keep the ground and so on. But that does not mean that there is no influence, legacy, or heritage of this tradition around the world. As a matter of fact, even young people are like John Robinson. Everybody read John Robinson, they like it, and Keynes and so forth. So I would say there is a legacy, there is a tradition, but there's not a critical mass in terms of numbers, in terms of ability to run a place. And this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult. But we should not give up hope. You're here for that, you you should not be discouraged in thinking, oh, this is, economics is all what they do, and something that I like doesn't have any possibility to be developed or to be. This is not true. The fact that you're here is a proof that there is an interest and there is a possibility. So, and I found that in many places around the world. So I'm personally, obviously, pessimist about the way in which economics is going, but I'm optimist by the fact that this is not the only game in town. There are other games that can be played, and I encourage people to play it because it can be done.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk again. This kind of builds up on Tom's point and what you just mentioned about sort of the critical mass. What, in your view, given your extensive study of John Robinson and the Cambridge tradition, what, in your view, are some of the conditions that it would take for these heterodox views to, again, become, perhaps not mainstream, but at least competitive? I
wish I knew, but
yeah.
Let me say, certainly there should be room at the level of education. If you delayed all the courses in which these things can be taught, it's very difficult to build a generation that will be able to compete. I was telling Anthony that even Amherst doesn't have a course in the history of economic thought any longer. There is no course in history of economic thought in the major university. You might call it the philosophy of economic history. I mean in critical theory, okay? There is no course in the economics in the great university that are offering this. And so if this is not done, it's very difficult to have people who get a PhD because there is no job. If there is no job, people will not ask a PhD in the subject. So you don't build. So I think the very beginning is to make sure that there is a doctoral program, PhD program, or a master degree in which these things are taught. And if this is not done, if you roll your tie, if there's no paper on that is the basic condition, I think. Then there is the second condition, is obviously the political setup. if education is not rely on the private sector too much, I don't think that they care about your critical thinking. If education does not become something which is in the public interest, to have educated, culturally sophisticated people, that is another condition that need to be accomplished. When I see more and more that is all this business-oriented education. I hope that Cambridge is not becoming that, but around the world, the idea that you are trained to have a job, which is obviously a good idea. But I remember what Marshall said, our job is to form, not to fill the minds. So this idea that education is about forming the minds. The British Empire was run by civil servants who took an exam, Latin and maths, no professional other. The idea is that you have to have a mind ready to be able to solve problems, logic, to be... so if the education become too much business-oriented, you educate people to have a skill to find a job, then the scope of critical thinking is obviously reduced. This is a general idea. So I would say you have to have programs in which there is scope for doing a type of alternative economics. There might be a general setup in which education can be finalized just to form people, not just to give them an opportunity for a job. We have to be less obsessed with maths, mathematics, econometrics, big data. I hope the artificial intelligence will do what they will do the thing, and we'll be able to think again, to read again, and let the artificial intelligence do the econometrics exercise for us. So there is time to do other things. That would be, so it's general, but it's also specific.
Thank you very much.
May I ask, what does it mean to say economics is science or driven by science, and what does it mean to say it is an ideology?
Well, we get in a quite complicated problem to 5 minutes to 9, and because the definition of science, it depends what philosophy of science what epistemology you have. If you are a Popperian, you are Lakatos, you are Kuhn, whatever inclination. So people would say, according to the definition of science that you have, then you can give an answer to this question. For instance, if you think that science is about prediction, so economics would not be a good science because it's never been predicted much so far. But that's the idea, that science is about prediction, Friedman, Popperian stuff. I think in Joan Robinson's sense, she was much more convinced that economics was a science when she was in her Popperian phase. Then in the end, she became less convinced so. But that does not mean that you cannot do good analysis. In other words, being a bit skeptical of the science in the sense of the positivism does not mean that you don't believe that you can be truth-seeking, that certain theories are better than others. It's just that what makes something a science that depends very much on your philosophical, epistemological background. I believe that nowadays economics is believed to be more scientific as long as you do modeling, mathematics, and prediction. That's the benchmark. And we, critical thinkers, are just blah, 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 blah. We're not scientific because we don't do modeling, we don't do econometrics, we don't do that. I personally believe that being scientific is not perhaps the right word, because it depends very much what you define science. And I would certainly, Joan Robinson believed that there was possibility of making a separation of propositions that have a strong ideological nature. I didn't have time to go into her lecture on mercantilism. She said, for instance, free trade, laissez-faire. used by those who would benefit from it. So it's a proposition that clearly shows the ideological part. But there are propositions that are less ideologically biased. And she wanted to make this separation. I don't think that's so easy to make that separation. Oh, this ideological, this is non-ideological. But it depends very much on what your philosophy, what your idea about science are. And there are as many ideas about science. Even the scientists disagree. If you talk, I am involved in the equivalent of your Royal Society, British Academy. It's called the Accademia dei Lincei. It's the only academy in the world. I'm foreign secretary of this academy. And the former president is a Nobel Prize, Giorgio Parisi, physicist. If you talk to him and you say what is science and so on, you can see that it's not like the economists think, that science is about, the physicists, the mathematicians are those which are much more critical than we are towards these tools. So it's a complicated matter, as I said, to discuss at 9 o'clock. But
do we have any other questions?
Yeah. Otherwise,
Can I make a point?
yes.
Just to make a connection between your speech, a question asked from Jessica, and something mentioned in the first Joan Robinson workshop we had. And we had the Professor Nuno Martins coming from the Catholic University from Porto. You mentioned how honest Joan was, and that sense of humility that she had. And then you said that towards the end of her career, she became quite pessimistic. In fact, some people say that that was evidence of some sort of nihilism, theoretical nihilism behind her. And I want to push you a little bit on that, because that was implied in Jessica's question, where she was essentially saying that perhaps she realized that modeling is not the way forward. And this is the reason why she did not pursue such an avenue for the future of economics. And in fact, what Nuno said in the previous workshop, he mentioned how Joan started placing an emphasis on the so-called rules of the game. Mm-hmm. Yes. The idea that distribution is something exogenous. Mm-hmm. You cannot determine it through marginal contributions.
It's not a technical thing.
Exactly. It's not a technical thing. In fact, it's a very political thing. And it has to do with how an entire system, political economic system, is being structured. Hence the rules of the game. Now, I was wondering whether this is not a sign of pessimism, but some sort of an encouragement to the newer generations of economists to consider different alternatives, different methodologies that can be deployed outside of modeling, and whether this might be consistent with some work that is being currently done in Cambridge in the name of social positioning theory. The idea that we need to start considering bundles of rights and obligations and how these rights and obligations structure economic systems instead of having some sort of an econometric approach or very abstract mathematical approach to it. Anyway, I don't know if it's still a question.
I fully agree with you. I think that she said, I study economics in my life. It says crumble in my hands. Jeff Harcourt, who knew her very well, she said that in the end she got into pessimism because she saw a world around her that she didn't recognize. And this happened to people in old age, that feel that they are extraneous to the world. But I think that she would completely agree with you in saying there is still time to doing things. Maybe not me, because I've done, but the young generation should be encouraged to do so. And as I said in my final sentence, I think there is scope for doing things. There is intellectually interesting thing to be done. There is ways in which we can do economics that's still interesting, challenging. Of course you have to pass your exams. Of course you will have to publish in journals that give you tenure if you do academic. But that doesn't mean that your mind need to be completely closed to anything else. And maybe, as it happened to me, I managed to have a successful career. Perhaps I was lucky by following my own inclination ideas, which were certainly not I never been neoclassical in my life. Perhaps I've been lucky, but I know other people who made a very good career without being committed to be a neoclassical economist. So there is scope, and there is, if there is a will, there is a way. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I did a little bit over time, but I hope that was enjoyable.
Yeah. Thank you.